Welcome to the Rainy Night Storyteller. Tonight, we gather once again under the veil of darkness to immerse ourselves in chilling tales of horror. Let the rain outside set the mood as we venture into the unknown. I hope this video brings you spine-tingling entertainment. Let me know in the comments which story haunts you the most. And if you enjoy the journey into the shadows, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss what lurks in the next video. Now, let's step into the mysteries that hide in the dark. Asterisk. The air was thick with humidity as I stepped out of my rental car, the evening heat of rural Louisiana wrapping around me like a damp shroud. The dirt driveway crunched under my boots as I approached the old plantation house, its wide columns and wraparound porch silhouetted against a bruised purple sky. Cicadas droned in the distance, their rhythmic buzzing blending with the occasional croak of a bullfrog from somewhere unseen. I adjusted the strap of my field bag and knocked on the heavy oak door. Within seconds, it swung open, revealing a petite woman in her 60s, her wiry frame draped in a floral house dress. "You must be Dr. Holloway," she said, her voice warm but edged with something unreadable. "That's me," I replied, offering a polite smile. "Nathan's fine." She stepped aside, motioning me in. The house smelled of aged wood and something faintly sweet, perhaps magnolia or old vanilla candles. "I'm Mrs. Delacroix," she introduced herself, closing the door behind me. "Welcome to Belle Rev." I nodded, glancing around the grand foyer. Despite the renovations, the house still held its history in its bones. The uneven floorboards, the heavy drapes, the antique mirror hanging above a mahogany table, its glass slightly warped with time. She led me through the hallway, her slippers barely making a sound on the polished floor. "You'll be in the East Wing. Plenty of space, and it stays cooler in the evenings." I followed, pausing at the large windows overlooking the land beyond. Acres of wild, tangled woods stretched into the distance, their dark shapes shifting in the twilight. A small flickering light, fireflies, maybe, danced along the edge of the tree line. "You're here for research, yes?" she asked, watching me closely. I nodded. "Field biology. I'm studying the wetlands, cataloging local wildlife populations. Shouldn't be here more than a couple of weeks." She hummed, as if weighing something. Then, in a quieter tone, she added, "You be careful out there, Dr. Holloway. The bayou don't always let folks find their way back." I turned toward her. "What do you mean?" "People get lost," she said simply. "And sometimes they don't get found." Her words carried an old, practiced warning, one that had been spoken many times before. I gave her a polite nod, but internally, I dismissed it. Superstitions, folklore, every place had them. That didn't stop the faint chill from creeping up my spine. Dinner was a communal affair, set at a long wooden table with a handful of other guests and a few locals who'd stopped by. The conversation drifted through various topics: weather, fishing, a recent gator sighting. Then, an older man, his hands thick and calloused from years of labor, mentioned something that caught my attention. "The old creek," he said, spearing a piece of cornbread with his fork. "Ain't nobody found it in years." Another man chuckled. "Because it moves." A woman scoffed. "Y'all stop filling the man's head with that nonsense." But I leaned forward. "What do you mean it moves?" The first man shrugged. "Used to be a little creek deep in them woods. Ran cool, real clear, even in the summer. But folks swear they'd see it one place. Then a month later, it'd be somewhere else. More like folks just got turned around," the woman cut in. "Maybe," he allowed. "But my granddaddy swore by it. Said he'd seen it in 3 different spots 20 years apart. Never ran dry, never stayed put." I felt a small flicker of curiosity stir in my chest. A creek appearing in different places? It didn't make sense. Hydrology didn't work like that. Either it was a trick of memory, or something geological was shifting the flow. Sinkholes, underground channels, something. I glanced at Mrs. Delacroix. She had been silent through the discussion, but now she pressed her lips into a thin line. "Enough of that," she said quietly. "It's not a place folks should go looking for." I raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" She didn't answer, just stood to clear the dishes. The message was clear, conversation over. But for me, The mystery had already taken root. Back in my room, I laid out my gear. Compass, notebook, flashlight, field recorder. The rational part of my mind told me this was just another local legend, nothing more. But I was a scientist. Curiosity was part of the job. If there really was an unknown water source, it could be an unregistered tributary or a seasonal flood channel. And if it was just a tall tale, well, I'd enjoy a morning hike. The old wooden clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching into the stillness of the night. I locked my door, shut off the light, and lay down. But the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like something was waiting. The morning air was thick, the kind of damp heat that clung to the skin and made every breath feel heavy. Mist curled low over the ground, weaving between the cypress trunks like pale fingers. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped lazily from the trees, but other than that, nothing. No birds, no insects. I paused at the tree line, adjusting my backpack. Normally, the bayou was alive at this hour. Frogs croaking, cicadas buzzing, birds calling through the branches. But today, the world felt hollow. I shook off the discomfort and pressed forward, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, leaf-strewn earth. Spanish moss draped over the branches like tattered gray curtains, swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. The deeper I went, the more the trees closed in, their gnarled roots snaking across the ground like veins. Every step felt like walking into something older than time itself. About half a mile in, I stepped over a fallen tree, its damp bark crumbling beneath my hand. That's when I heard it. Soft, breathless, right behind me. Keep going. I froze. The voice had been so close, like someone standing just over my shoulder. I turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing, just trunks, roots, and hanging moss shifting slightly in the mist. I let out a slow breath, my rational mind immediately searching for an explanation. A trick of the wind? Some small animal I hadn't noticed? Still, the sound had been distinctly human. I shook my head and kept walking. I pulled out my field recorder and clicked it on, my voice steady but low. Unusual acoustics in this area. Possible sound reflection off the water. That was logical. The bayou had plenty of odd echo chambers. Water, dense vegetation, shifting temperatures. Still, my fingers were just a little too tight around the recorder. I took another step, then another, focusing on my surroundings. The trees were thick here, their twisted limbs forming a natural corridor. The path I was following, if it even was a path, was narrowing, the undergrowth closing in. The feeling in my chest wasn't fear. Not yet. It was something quieter, heavier, like being watched. 5 minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was closer, softer, almost playful. You're almost there. I stopped cold. The voice had come from my left. No, my right. No, everywhere. A breath of wind moved through the trees, stirring the moss. I turned in a slow circle, my pulse hammering against my ribs. There was no one. Nothing but trees stretching endlessly in every direction. Then, in the corner of my eye, a shadow, quick, darting between the trunks. I spun toward it, my breath caught in my throat. The fog had thickened, blurring the shapes of the trees. But I could have sworn I saw something, someone, moving just out of reach. I swallowed hard. The woods had felt big before. Now, they felt endless. I pushed forward, stepping carefully over thick roots and patches of mud. My breathing was steady, but inside, something gnawed at me, an unease I couldn't shake. Then, suddenly I saw it. A creek. It wasn't wide, maybe 5 feet across, but it cut through the tangled undergrowth like a dark vein. The water was still, unnaturally so. Even where it met the shore, there were no ripples, no sign of movement. And the color, not the muddy brown I'd expect from a bayou stream. This water was darker, thicker, almost black. I stepped closer, kneeling at the edge. My GPS was still clipped to my pack, so I checked the screen, expecting to see a small tributary mapped out. Nothing. According to the device, there was no water here. No recorded creek. That was impossible. I glanced back at the stream, my reflection barely visible in the ink-like surface. A deep, uneasy feeling settled in my gut. I reached into my bag for a sample vial. If this was some kind of unusual mineral deposit or algae bloom, I wanted to analyze it later. Carefully, I unscrewed the cap and leaned forward. That's when I heard it. A giggle. Soft, high-pitched, childlike. I froze, the vial still in my hand. It had come from across the creek, just beyond the fog. But the trees were too dense, the mist too thick. I couldn't see anything. I swallowed hard, my pulse suddenly too loud in my ears. There was no reason for a child to be out here. No houses for miles. Yet I had heard it. Clear as day. Slowly, I straightened. My mouth felt dry. Hello. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Is someone there? Silence. The trees loomed ahead, their twisted branches barely visible through the mist. I scanned the opposite bank, my fingers gripping the sample vial like a lifeline. Nothing moved. I exhaled, shaking my head. Maybe it was an echo, my mind playing tricks on me. This place was getting to me. Then, another giggle. Right behind me. I whipped around so fast I nearly lost my balance. My heart slammed against my ribs, my eyes darting across the trees. There was no one. Nothing but the thick woods pressing in around me. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it now. A presence. Something watching. And it was close. The air changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in temperature, a sudden weight pressing against my chest. The smell of damp earth and moss grew stronger, cloying. Then I noticed the trees. They looked different. I turned in a slow circle, my breath coming shallow. The path I had taken to get here, it was gone. The trunks were unfamiliar, gnarled and twisted in ways I didn't remember. The hanging moss seemed thicker, the ground beneath me softer, as if the forest had moved. I took a step back and heard nothing. No crunch of leaves, no shift of dirt. I lifted my foot and brought it down again. Still nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed my sound. My pulse pounded in my ears. My throat tightened. I wasn't supposed to be here, and I wasn't sure I could leave. I didn't hesitate. I turned and started walking fast, then faster, until my stride turned into a full sprint. The air felt heavier, pressing against my skin like damp cloth, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. But the path was gone. Every direction I turned, the trees closed in tighter. The landmarks I had mentally noted, the twisted oak, the fallen log, had vanished. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind. I forced myself to breathe, stay rational. I had my compass. I yanked it from my pocket, but the needle spun wildly, as if caught in an unseen current. That was impossible. I swallowed down the rising fear and picked a direction, any direction. I walked, and walked, and walked. Then, the creek, right in front of me. Again, I hadn't turned around. I was sure of it. But somehow, no matter which way I went, I ended up back here. The dark, unmoving water. The thick fog curling along the banks. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I gritted my teeth and turned away from the creek. I try again. Keep moving. That's when I heard it. A whisper, right against my ear. Why are you leaving? Stay and play. A cold breath brushed the back of my neck. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. My chest heaved. My skin crawled. There was no one there. My fingers fumbled for my field recorder. I needed proof. I needed something to ground myself. I pressed the record button. Nothing. The screen flickered. Then dead. My only source of documentation was useless. I gripped it tighter, pulse hammering. This was just interference. A battery failure. The compass, just a magnetic anomaly. There had to be a reason. There had to be. But deep down, something primal inside me whispered a different answer. Run. The air around me felt thick, like the atmosphere before a storm. I turned back toward the creek, my breath coming in short gasps. Then, movement. A shadow stirred within the fog, just on the other side of the water. At first, it looked like a person, crouched low, almost blending into the mist. Then it moved, slow, deliberate, unfolding. Its limbs were too thin, too long, and its head, it tilted, far, too far, like a predator sizing up its prey. A wave of nausea rolled through me. My instincts screamed. I didn't wait. I ran. I ran. The air burned in my lungs, my legs screaming with each frantic step. The mud clung to my boots, pulling, slowing me down, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. Branches whipped against my arms, brambles scraped my legs, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heartbeat. The forest around me twisted, unfamiliar, endless, until suddenly, I broke through. The trees thinned, and before I could register what was happening, I stumbled into a clearing. My boots skidded on gravel. I was standing just yards away from the B&B. The sight of it nearly buckled my knees. The porch, the warm glow of the lanterns, the smell of damp earth. Real things, tangible things. I was back, and I wasn't alone. Mrs. Delacroix stood at the front steps, arms crossed over her chest, watching, waiting. Her face was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something knowing. I staggered forward, my breath still uneven. My voice cracked. I found it. The creek. She didn't move. I ran a shaking hand through my damp hair. Something's out there, I gasped. I heard voices. Saw something. She didn't look surprised. She just nodded. Told you, she said, voice quiet. Some places don't want to be found. I blinked, waiting for more, denial, questions, anything. But she said nothing else. I opened my mouth, but her expression stopped me. Grim, tired, as if she had seen this before. Instead of pressing, I just swallowed hard and nodded. Then, without another word, I walked past her into the house, locking the door behind me. That night, I sat at the small wooden desk in my room, hands shaking as I scrolled through my field recorder. Most of the recordings were corrupted, static, glitches, some cut off entirely, except one clear snippet, buried in the distortion. I pressed play. For a moment, nothing but white noise. Then, a voice, soft, whispering, right into my ear. We'll find you again soon, Nathan. I nearly dropped the recorder. My chest went cold. I hadn't told anyone my name. I left the next morning. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just a quick email to my university stating that I was cutting the trip short due to unforeseen circumstances. The truth? I wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. On the drive to the airport, I checked my GPS one last time. The creek, the dark, unnatural stream, wasn't marked on any official maps. No records of it. No tributary listed. It was as if it had never existed. As if it had never wanted to be found. I never filed a report about what happened. My notes, my samples, my data, none of it mattered. And the field recorder? It stayed locked in a drawer, untouched. I couldn't bear to listen to that voice again. Months passed. I tried to forget. Tried. But some nights, when the world was too quiet, I swore I could still hear it. That whisper. Then, one rainy afternoon, a package arrived. No return address. No markings. Just my name. I hesitated before opening it, my fingers cold against the damp cardboard. Inside, nestled in crumpled brown paper, was a small, waterlogged toy doll. Its hair was matted, its stitched eyes uneven. The smell of damp earth and stagnant water clung to it. My breath hitched as I noticed a note, scrawled in childish, uneven handwriting. I picked it up. Read the words. You found us. Next time, we'll find you. I stared at the note for a long time, my hands trembling. Then, without another thought, I threw the entire box into the fire, watched as the flames consumed it. The smell of burning fabric filled the room. But as the last ember flickered out, I swear, just for a second, I heard a giggle, soft, breathless, right behind me. I still think about that night. The way the air felt heavier the deeper we rode into the woods. The way the trees swallowed the last traces of daylight. But most of all, I remember the warning. Danny and I had been riding together for years. He was my closest friend, the kind of guy who lived for the road, especially the ones nobody else dared to take. At 23, he had already been on more adventures than most people would in a lifetime. Me? I was just a year older, a little more cautious, but I never turned down a ride. That evening, we had decided on the forest highway. It was one of those roads you'd hear about from old-timers in town. Winding, barely traveled, and, according to some, cursed. We didn't believe in curses. We believed in asphalt, open air, and the hum of an engine beneath us. Before heading out, we stopped at this tiny gas station on the outskirts of town. The place looked like it had been there forever. Faded signs, a single rusted-out pump, and an old man behind the counter who looked just as weathered as the building itself. He watched us as we filled up, barely blinking. When we walked inside to pay, he spoke up, voice dry as dead leaves. "Not many people drive that road after dark." Danny smirked, brushing it off. "Yeah? Why's that?" The old man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You see a car stopped, don't stop. Just keep riding." I chuckled, thinking it was just some backwoods superstition. "Why?" The man's expression didn't change. "Because not everyone out there is looking for help." Danny rolled his eyes, tossing a 20 on the counter. "We'll keep that in mind." The bell above the door jingled as we stepped back outside. The sky was already turning that deep shade of blue that comes just before night fully settles in. A cold breeze rustled the trees, scattering dried leaves across the pavement. "Creepy old guy," Danny muttered, strapping his helmet on. "Probably just trying to scare us." That's what I told myself, too. But as we pulled onto the road and disappeared into the dense, darkened forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that his warning wasn't just some small-town paranoia. It was something else. Something real. The first 10 miles were just how I imagined. Twisting roads, towering trees, and the kind of silence that made you feel like the world had shrunk down to just you, your bike, and the narrow ribbon of asphalt ahead. Then I saw it. A car, parked on the side of the road. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe someone pulled over to take a break. But then I saw the man. He stood next to the driver's side, completely still, facing the road. He wasn't checking his phone, wasn't looking under the hood, wasn't even pacing. He was just standing there, watching. The shadows from the trees and the dimming light made it hard to make out his face, but I could feel his eyes on us. A cold, crawling sensation spread through my chest, something instinctive, something wrong. Danny must have felt it too. We rode past in silence, but I caught him shudder slightly, something he never did. A few seconds later, he muttered, "That guy was giving off serious serial killer vibes." I forced a chuckle, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The way that man stood, how he didn't move at all, like he had been waiting for us. Waiting. We kept going, not daring to look back. But the feeling didn't leave. It clung to my skin like the damp night air, a whisper of unease riding with us. Then, the headlights appeared. At first, I thought it was just another car finally coming down the road. But as I glanced in my mirror, my stomach clenched. It was the same car. The exact same one that had been parked on the roadside. I knew because of the headlights. One was slightly dimmer than the other. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. Danny must have noticed too, because he glanced at his mirror, then back at me. "That's him." The road stretched ahead of us, empty and dark. No intersections, no driveways, just trees. There was no way he had taken another route to end up behind us. And yet, there he was. He wasn't tailgating, wasn't trying to pass, just keeping pace, his headlights a steady, unblinking pair of eyes tracking us. I swallowed hard, gripping the handlebars a little tighter. Danny accelerated slightly. So did the car. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. We were being followed. I kept telling myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe it was just some guy heading the same way as us. Maybe we were overreacting. So, I suggested a test. "Slow down a little," I called out over the wind. "Let's see if he passes." Danny nodded, easing off the throttle. My heart pounded as we dropped to a crawl, our bikes humming softly against the silence. The car slowed, too. I clenched my jaw. There was no hesitation, no delay. It matched our speed perfectly, keeping that same eerie distance behind us. Danny swerved slightly, shifting from side to side in his lane, a silent invitation for the driver to go around. The car mimicked his movements, staying locked in place. This wasn't coincidence. Danny shot me a look, his face tense even under his helmet. He didn't have to say it. I knew what he was thinking. We had to go. Danny gave me a quick signal, then twisted the throttle hard. The roar of his engine shattered the night as he surged forward, and I followed close behind. The world blurred past us, trees becoming smears of darkness, the road a fleeting ribbon under our wheels. The car shrank in the distance, its headlights dimming until they were little more than two specks in the abyss. For a moment, I thought we had done it. For a moment, I let myself breathe. Then we hit the curve. It was a sharp one, the kind that forced you to ease up or risk skidding off the road. We had no choice but to slow down. And that's when I saw them. The headlights. Not in the distance. Right behind us. My stomach lurched. There was no way he should have been able to catch up that fast. No way. And yet, here he was, closer than before, his headlights flooding our mirrors, blinding us. Then the car lunged forward. I felt it before I fully saw it. The shift in air, the vibration in the road. My whole body tensed as the car closed the gap, the front bumper almost kissing my back wheel. I swerved, barely avoiding contact. My heart slammed against my ribs. This wasn't just some lunatic messing around. This guy wanted us off the road. And if we didn't do something fast, he was going to get his wish. Danny was ahead of me, his bike jerking slightly as he dodged another sharp push from the car behind us. My hands were tight on the handlebars, heart hammering so loud I could barely hear the roar of my engine. Then I saw it. A narrow dirt path to the right, barely noticeable in the dark. It looked more like a deer trail than a road. But at this point, we didn't have time to be picky. I shouted, "Right. Take the trail." Danny barely hesitated. He yanked his handlebars hard, veering off the pavement and onto the dirt path. I followed, tires slipping on the sudden shift from asphalt to mud. Behind us, the car skidded to a stop. The engine idled, headlights beaming like two burning eyes into the woods. But he didn't follow. I didn't dare look back for long, but I caught a glimpse of him, just sitting there, watching. We didn't stop until we were deep into the woods. The hum of our engines softened to a low purr. I could barely see Danny through the thick trees, his headlights illuminating nothing but tangled branches and damp earth. We pulled over, both of us breathing hard. The silence was suffocating. No tires on pavement, no growl of an engine, just the wind rustling through dead leaves, whispering through the trees like a warning. I swallowed and whispered, "I think we lost him." Danny didn't respond right away. He was staring back toward the direction we came from, the trail barely visible in the dark. I could tell he wasn't convinced. I opened my mouth to say something else when I heard it. A sound, soft at first, barely audible over my own pulse. Crunch. A slow, deliberate step on dried leaves. Danny heard it too. He turned his head slightly, body stiff. Crunch. Another step. Closer this time. We weren't alone. Then, from the tangled mass of trees ahead, a figure stepped into view. The man. The same one from the roadside. The same one from the car. He was standing barely 20 feet away, just inside the tree line, his body partially swallowed by the shadows. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything but watch. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the distant murmur of our idling bikes. Danny whispered, "What the hell does he want?" I had no answer, because in that moment, with his blank expression, hands buried deep in his pockets, I realized something. He hadn't chased us. He had let us come to him. Danny didn't say a word. He didn't need to. We both kicked our bikes into gear at the same time, engines roaring to life, shattering the eerie silence. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, narrow, twisting, and uneven, littered with exposed roots and jagged rocks. It wasn't meant for motorcycles, but we had no choice. We gunned the throttle. Branches snapped against my arms, thorns scraping at my jacket as we tore through the forest. The tires skidded in the loose dirt, fighting for traction, every bump threatening to throw us off balance. I told myself not to look back. I told myself. But I did, and that's when I saw him. He was moving. No, not moving. Running. Full speed. Straight at us. The headlights barely caught the blur of his shape, his long strides unnaturally fast. He wasn't stumbling. He wasn't struggling. He was sprinting like something that didn't belong in a human body. A sharp branch smacked my helmet, jolting me back to the road. I twisted the throttle harder. I could hear Danny just ahead of me, his bike tearing through the dirt, fighting to stay upright. The trees thinned. The path widened slightly. My breath came in ragged bursts. Then, suddenly, we broke free. The woods spat us out onto an old back road, the pavement slick and smooth beneath our tires. We swerved, straightened, and then silence. No footsteps. No movement. No sign of him. Danny glanced over his shoulder. I did the same. The tree line stood still, the darkness behind it thick and impenetrable. The man was gone, but I knew he was still there, somewhere, watching. We didn't wait. We sped toward the nearest town, the hum of streetlights appearing in the distance, their glow spilling onto the empty road ahead. The world felt normal again. Cars parked along sidewalks, houses with warm lights in their windows, civilization wrapping itself around us like a shield. My chest heaved. My fingers ached from gripping the handlebars too hard. Then I saw it. Or rather, him. Danny, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. Danny glanced in his mirror, then snapped his head forward again, his entire body stiff. There, on the side of the road, just outside the reach of the streetlights, he stood. Still, motionless, watching, the same way he had before, the same way he always would. We didn't go home that night. The moment we reached the first gas station on the outskirts of town, we parked our bikes and went straight to the sheriff's office. We must have looked like hell. Faces pale, jackets torn from the branches, hands shaking slightly as we recounted every detail. The deputy on duty, a heavy-set man with graying hair, listened quietly. He didn't interrupt, didn't roll his eyes like we were crazy. He just sat there, arms crossed, nodding along. When we finally finished, Danny leaned forward. Well, are you going to send someone out there? The deputy exhaled, rubbed his face, and muttered something I still hear in my head to this day. You're not the first to tell me about that guy. Danny and I exchanged a look. I swallowed. Who is he? The deputy hesitated. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he simply said, "Go home, boys." And that was it. No explanation. No further questions. Just a vague warning wrapped in something that felt uncomfortably close to acceptance. Weeks passed. The fear faded, but it never disappeared. Danny and I tried to go back to normal, but neither of us took that highway again. Every now and then, we'd bring up that night in hushed tones, both of us wondering the same thing. Had we been the first, or just the latest? Then one night, Danny called me. His voice was different, low, serious. I found something, he said. He had spent the last few days digging through old news archives, looking for anything about strange happenings on that road. And he found it. An article from 1994. 2 bikers, young guys like us, had vanished without a trace while riding through the same stretch of forest highway. Their bodies were never found. Their bikes? Discovered weeks later in the woods, hidden beneath leaves and brush, as if someone had taken the time to hide them. And the last reported sighting of the 2 men? A passing driver recalled seeing them earlier that evening. They were riding past a parked car, with a man standing beside it, watching. A month later, Danny got a package in the mail. No return address, no postage marks, just a plain, unmarked envelope sitting on his doorstep. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It was us, taken that night. It wasn't from a distance, either. It wasn't some blurry shot taken from a security camera or a passing car. No, this was different. It was taken from the roadside, from his perspective, before the chase, before the madness, before we even knew what was coming. Danny called me immediately. He didn't say a word at first. He didn't have to, because deep down, we both knew the truth. We got away that night, but he was still watching. And somehow, he knew where to find us. My name is Ethan Marshall. I'm a freelance photographer, and my passion has always been capturing forgotten places, abandoned buildings, rusting cars, remnants of lives long left behind. There's something about decay that fascinates me, the way nature slowly reclaims what humans have abandoned. Maybe that's why, over the years, I've found myself drawn to empty places most people avoid. Logan Carter, my best friend since high school, never understood my obsession, but he loved the thrill of tagging along. He was an amateur urban explorer, though in truth, he was more of a skeptic than anything else. If a place was rumored to be haunted, he'd go out of his way to prove otherwise. He was the kind of guy who laughed in the face of ghost stories, always searching for a rational explanation. It was on our way home from a weekend camping trip that we stumbled across it. An old house hidden away on a back road we had no intention of taking. The detour had been Logan's idea. "Come on," he'd said, grinning as he traced a new route on his phone. What's the worst that could happen? The road was narrower than I expected, its surface cracked and riddled with potholes, as if no one had driven on it in years. Dense trees lined both sides, their bare branches tangled like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. It was overcast that day, the thick clouds swallowing what little daylight remained. The deeper we drove, the more the silence pressed in on us. No distant hum of traffic, no birds, not even the rustling of wind through the trees. Just stillness. I gripped the wheel a little tighter. This place is dead. Logan chuckled from the passenger seat. That's the best part. Then, as we rounded a bend, I saw it. The house sat far back from the road, half swallowed by overgrown brush. At first, it barely looked like a house at all, just a dark shape behind tangled vines and collapsed fencing. As I slowed the car, the details sharpened. The wood siding was gray and splintered, sagging inward like the house had given up on holding itself together. The porch was half collapsed, its broken boards jutting out at odd angles. Shattered windows stared back at us like empty eye sockets. A rusted mailbox leaned to one side, its post half buried in the earth. There was no name, no number, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. Damn, Logan whistled. That's a real fixer-upper. I didn't laugh. I didn't even respond. Something about the house made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the decay. I'd seen plenty of ruined places before. This felt different. The air had changed, thickening like the weight of a coming storm. A faint pressure settled against my ears, as if the world had suddenly grown quieter. Logan nudged me. You're not seriously going to drive past without taking a shot? I hesitated. I don't know, man. Something feels off. He grinned. What? You think it's haunted? No, I lied. Come on, just a few quick shots. He pointed toward the house. Look at this place. It's exactly the kind of thing you love shooting. What are you scared of? I wanted to say I didn't know. I wanted to explain that my instincts were screaming at me to leave. But Logan was right. I'd come across countless abandoned places before, and none of them had scared me. This shouldn't be any different. Reluctantly, I rolled down the window and lifted my camera. I snapped 3 quick photos from the car, each frame capturing the house from a slightly different angle. I didn't dare zoom in, didn't let my eyes linger too long. The unease gnawed at me, pushing me to move. All right, I said. Got the shot. Let's go. Logan groaned. That's it. Not even gonna get out. Nope. He laughed, but didn't argue. As I pulled away, I checked my rearview mirror one last time. And for a split second, my stomach dropped. The house looked different. The crumbling porch, the shattered windows, the overgrown brush, it was all gone. In its place stood a house that was whole. The wood siding was clean, freshly painted. The windows gleamed in the dim light. The mailbox stood upright, polished brass numbers shining against the rust-free metal. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was back to what it had been before, a rotting husk of forgotten ruin. I swallowed hard and forced my eyes back to the road. It was just my imagination. It had to be. We drove on in silence. It wasn't until a few days later that I thought about the house again. I had pushed it to the back of my mind, writing off the strange feeling as just a mix of exhaustion and paranoia. But that image, the impossible shift between ruin and restoration, kept creeping back into my thoughts. So, on a quiet afternoon, curiosity got the best of me. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up Google Earth. It wasn't unusual for me to check satellite images of places I photographed. Sometimes, I'd use them to mark interesting spots for future trips, or to see how abandoned buildings had changed over the years. I typed in the coordinates for my camera's metadata and zoomed in. My fingers froze. The house wasn't there. I blinked, double-checked the location. The cracked road, the dense trees, even the curve where we had stopped, it was all correct. But where the house should have been, there was nothing. Just a patch of land covered in wild grass, as if nothing had ever been built there. Confused, I scrolled back through older images. Google Earth lets you go through past satellite views, sometimes stretching back decades. If the house had once existed, I'd be able to see it in earlier versions. But every image was the same. A clearing, empty land, no house. I sat back in my chair, my pulse quickening. That didn't make sense. We had seen it. I had photographed it. Heart pounding, I grabbed my camera from my bag and connected it to my computer. I needed to see the photos again, needed to reassure myself that I hadn't imagined it. As the files loaded, I pulled up the first few shots, the ones I had taken from my phone. There it was, just as I remembered. The rotting wood, the broken windows, the half-buried mailbox. Then, I opened the images from my professional camera. My breath caught in my throat. The house was gone. The photos were identical to the ones on my phone. Same angle, same framing, same lighting. But where the house should have been, there was only an empty field, overgrown with weeds and tangled roots. I flipped through every single shot, my hands trembling. The road, the trees, the sky, they were all there, unchanged. But the house? It was missing, as if it had never existed at all. My stomach twisted. I knew what I had seen. Logan had seen it too. I needed to tell him. Dude, you're overthinking this. Logan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as I showed him the photos. Google Earth gets things wrong all the time. Maybe the satellite images are outdated. I shook my head. Then why is it missing from older images too? And why is it only gone in my camera shots? If it was some kind of glitch, wouldn't it affect both my phone and my Nikon? Logan shrugged. Maybe your camera had a setting messed up. Exposure issue, lens defect, I don't know. But ghosts don't just erase themselves from photos. I exhaled sharply. I'm not saying it's a ghost. I don't have an explanation. Logan smirked. That's because there isn't one. But I'll tell you what, let's settle this the right way. I frowned. What do you mean? He leaned forward, grinning. We go back. I stiffened. No way. Why not? If the house is really there, we'll see it again. And if it's not, then you can freak out all you want. Every instinct in me screamed against it. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see the place again. Needed to know if it was real. Fine, I muttered. We'll go back this weekend. The road felt different this time. Maybe it was just my nerves, but as we drove deeper into the woods, the sense of isolation became suffocating. The trees pressed in on either side, their bare branches tangled like grasping hands. The cracked pavement stretched endlessly ahead. No intersections, no signs, no proof that anyone else had ever driven this way. Logan was quieter than usual, tapping his fingers against his knee as he stared out the window. He had laughed off my unease earlier, but now, even he seemed more focused, more alert. No passing cars, no distant farmhouses, just us and the road. We should be getting close, he murmured, glancing at his phone. I nodded, gripping the wheel a little tighter. The last time we had been here, something had felt wrong, but I had told myself it was just my imagination. Now, I wasn't so sure. Then, as we rounded the final bend, I slammed the brakes. The house was there, but it wasn't the same. Instead of a crumbling ruin, the house now looked lived in. The porch was no longer sagging, its beams freshly repaired. The broken windows were intact, glass gleaming in the dim light. The warped, peeling siding had been repainted, though the color was an unsettling shade of gray, like storm clouds. The overgrown brush had been trimmed back, revealing a dirt path leading to the front steps. My stomach twisted. This wasn't possible. What the hell? Logan muttered. I swallowed hard, my eyes flicking to a nearby tree. A no trespassing sign had been nailed to the bark, the letters bold and freshly painted. That sign hadn't been there before. Logan turned to me, his voice lower now. Are we in the wrong place? I shook my head. No, this is it. But this house wasn't the one we had seen. The stillness was unnatural. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds, not even the distant hum of insects. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. I had felt this weight before, the thick, charged energy pressing against my skin like the air before a thunderstorm. But this time it was worse, heavier. I forced myself to move, lifting my camera. The second I pointed it at the house, Logan muttered, I think we should go. I turned to him, surprised. Logan never backed down from anything. But now, he was stiff, his jaw clenched, eyes locked on the house like he was waiting for it to move. That was the first moment I felt true fear. I lowered my camera. Yeah, okay. Then, From the upstairs window, something shifted. My breath caught in my throat. A shadow. It wasn't just movement, it was watching us. I couldn't make out the features. The figure stood behind the glass, blurred, almost glitching, like a corrupted image on a screen. My vision struggled to process it, my brain rejecting what I was seeing. My hands went cold. The house was aware of us. Then came the sound. A low, vibrating hum, almost beneath the range of hearing, like a massive power source had switched on. It crawled into my bones, filling my skull, pressing against my teeth. The sky darkened, not naturally, not like clouds rolling in. It was like something was pushing the light away. Logan grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my sleeve. Go. Now. The moment we turned, the air felt heavier, as if gravity itself had shifted. Each step toward the car was like walking through water, every movement slower, harder. The hum grew louder. I threw the car door open, barely aware of Logan diving into the passenger seat. My hands fumbled with the keys, my pulse hammering. Then, just as the engine roared to life, I made the mistake of looking back. The house was gone. Not changed, not restored, gone. Only the clearing remained. No trespassing sign. No repaired porch. No shadow in the window. Just empty land. Untouched. As if nothing had ever been there at all. The sound stopped. The pressure lifted. The world exhaled. We didn't speak as I hit the gas and sped away. The road stretching endlessly ahead. The trees swallowing us whole. Neither of us dared to look back again. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Logan, usually the first to crack a joke or brush things off, stared straight ahead, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. I kept my eyes on the road, still expecting to see something, anything, in the rearview mirror. But there was nothing. No house. No figure in the window. Just the long stretch of cracked pavement behind us. When we finally got back to town, I pulled into Logan's driveway and cut the engine. Neither of us moved. Finally, Logan exhaled sharply. Okay, that was weird. I turned to him. Weird? That's all you've got? He let out a humorless laugh. What do you want me to say? The house was there, then it wasn't. That's impossible, man. Houses don't just vanish. But it did. Logan scrubbed a hand through his hair, still staring out the windshield. We need to figure out what the hell we just saw. I agreed. And so, the next day, we started digging. At first, our research led nowhere. There was no record of a house ever being built at that location. No old property deeds, no land surveys, nothing in public archives. It was like that land had always been empty. But then, we found something. Buried in old newspaper clippings and obscure online forums, a local legend surfaced. It was vague, mostly retellings from second-hand sources, but the pattern was there. A house, appearing only to some. A house that wasn't always in the same condition. Sometimes a ruin, sometimes pristine. A house that called people back. And those who answered, they didn't always come back. The reports spanned decades. The earliest mention dated back to the 1940s, when a traveling salesman claimed to have seen a house in those woods, only to return and find nothing but empty land. In the 1970s, 2 hikers went missing in the same area. Their last known location? Blackwood Road. Logan sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This is ridiculous. It's just a story. Then how do you explain what we saw? He didn't answer. That night, I decided to review my camera footage again. I knew what I would find, an empty clearing, just like before. But after everything we had read, I had to check. I connected the camera to my laptop, scrolling through the images from our second visit. At first, it was exactly what I expected. Photo after photo of nothing, just the empty clearing where the house had stood. Then, I reached the last image, and my stomach dropped. There, in the clearing, stood a group of people. At least 6 of them, maybe more. They were facing the camera, their bodies rigid, their heads slightly tilted. But their faces, they were wrong. Blurry, warped, like someone had smeared their features with wet paint. The more I stared, the worse it got. My eyes couldn't focus, as if my brain refused to process them properly. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. They hadn't been there when we took the photo. Had they? I slammed my laptop shut. That was enough for one night. I woke up to a text message at 3:12 a.m. No name, no number, just an image. With shaking hands, I opened it. It was a photograph of me and Logan standing in front of the house, but neither of us had taken it. And beneath the image, a single message. You shouldn't have come back. Weeks passed. Neither of us wanted to bring it up, but the silence between us felt heavier than ever. Logan had stopped cracking jokes. I barely touched my camera. There was something unfinished about it, like we had left a door open that we weren't supposed to. And then, one night, Logan sent me a text. We should go back. One last time. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to move on, to pretend that none of it had ever happened. But I couldn't. I needed to know. The road was just as empty as before, but this time, it felt different. Lighter. The thick, oppressive weight was gone, as if something had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. When we reached the clearing, my heart pounded. There was nothing. No house. No remnants of a foundation. Not even the no trespassing sign. It was as if nothing had ever been there. Logan let out a slow breath. Well, that's that. But I wasn't so sure. Because even though the house was gone, I could still feel it. Watching. Waiting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that if we had stayed just a little longer, if we had stepped onto that land again, it would have come back. The dream started a few days later. They were always the same. I was standing in front of the house, but it wasn't ruined this time. It was pristine, welcoming, the warm glow of light spilling from its windows. A shadow moved behind the curtains, waiting for me. I never saw its face, but I knew it was smiling. And then, one night, I woke up to something worse. I swung my legs out of bed, still groggy from sleep. My foot brushed against something cold. I looked down. Dirt, caked onto my shoes, streaked across the floor, like I had been somewhere else. Like I had walked through that clearing again, but I hadn't left my house. Had I? I sat there in the dark, heart hammering, the taste of soil thick in my throat. The house had let us go, but it wasn't done with me. Not yet. I don't like the dark. I've told myself 1,000 times that it's an irrational fear, that there's nothing lurking in the shadows, no figures waiting just beyond my vision, no hands reaching for me when I turn away. But fear isn't rational. I live in a trailer park just outside of town, where the streetlights flicker and the neighbors keep to themselves. It's a quiet place, the kind where you can hear the wind whispering through the trees and the distant hum of a passing train late at night. Most of the kids at school live in proper houses, with backyards and garages. Me? My world is smaller. Just our trailer, the cracked pavement outside, and the railway tracks stretching far into the distance. The tracks are a shortcut. They cut straight through town, running past the woods, past the empty fields, and right up to the edge of the Walmart parking lot. It's the fastest way to go, and almost everyone uses them at some point. I don't like walking the tracks at night, but during the day, it's not so bad. That afternoon, I was doing what I always did, killing time until my parents got home from work. Mom worked a double shift at the diner. Dad had some late job fixing a busted-up truck. I was used to being alone. It didn't bother me much. At least, that's what I told myself. I packed a few crumpled dollar bills into my hoodie pocket and slung my backpack over my shoulder. It was a routine trip. Head to Walmart, grab some snacks, maybe a new comic book, and be back before the sun dipped below the trees. The air was thick with the smell of dry leaves and far-off smoke, the kind of scent that signaled summer's slow death and fall's creeping arrival. The sun, hovering just above the tree-line, bathed everything in gold, stretching my shadow long across the gravel path. I took a deep breath. It's just a straight path, I told myself. Nothing to be scared of. And then, I started walking. By the time I stepped out of Walmart, the sun had slipped lower in the sky, staining the horizon a deep shade of orange. I checked my phone. 5:48 p.m. Plenty of time to make it back before dark. The plastic bag in my hand rustled as I adjusted my grip, the weight of a soda bottle and a couple of snack packs swinging against my leg. The comic book I'd picked up was tucked safely under my arm, the edges crisp and new. I told myself it was a normal evening, just like any other. But the air had changed. It wasn't just the temperature, though that had dropped too, making my hoodie feel suddenly thin. It was something else, a kind of stillness. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional distant hum of traffic from the main road. No voices, no barking dogs. Even the usual Walmart parking lot chatter had faded behind me. I reached the start of the tracks and hesitated. The shadows were longer now, stretching across the gravel like fingers reaching for something unseen. The trees on either side of the path swayed in the wind, their branches creaking softly. I swallowed hard and adjusted my backpack. It's just a straight path. I started walking. 10 minutes in, I was halfway home. The golden glow of sunset had begun to fade, and the shadows seemed thicker, deeper. I kept my head down, hands tucked into my hoodie pockets, focusing on the crunch of my sneakers against the gravel. One step at a time. And then, another crunch. I stopped. The sound stopped too. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance over my shoulder. The tracks behind me stretched empty into the distance. Nothing but gravel, trees, and the sliver of sky now turning dusky blue. Probably just my own footsteps echoing. I exhaled, shaking my head. My imagination had a way of playing tricks on me, especially when I was alone. I forced myself to keep walking, picking up the pace. Crunch. I froze again. The sound had returned. This time, I listened carefully, my pulse quickening. The footsteps weren't just echoing mine, they were matching them. When I walked, they walked. When I stopped, they stopped. A chill slithered down my spine. I turned around fully now, scanning the tracks, the trees, even the narrow dirt paths leading into the woods. Nothing, just silence. I told myself to move. My feet felt sluggish, but I forced them forward, walking faster now, the plastic bags swinging in my grip. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears. Crunch. My stomach dropped. I stopped, but this time, the footsteps didn't stop immediately. For a second, maybe less, they continued. Just long enough to confirm what I already knew. Someone was there. My heart pounded against my ribs. My throat tightened. I turned my head slightly, forcing myself to whisper, my voice barely more than breath. Hello. The tracks answered with silence. And that was worse than anything else. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I didn't dare move. My skin prickled, my ears strained for any sound, any shift in the air, but all I heard was the distant rustling of leaves and the faint hum of a passing car far beyond the trees. And then, crunch, footsteps, again. But this time, they weren't just following. They were getting faster. Panic jolted through me, my body moving before my mind caught up. I started walking, then jogging. My breaths came short and quick, the plastic bags swinging wildly at my side. My sneakers scuffed against the gravel, my pace uneven, desperate. I didn't want to look back. Every instinct screamed, don't look, just go, just run, but I did. I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. The tracks stretched empty behind me, bathed in the last fading light of day. The trees stood still, their branches swaying only slightly in the wind. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. Am I imagining this? My feet slowed for just a moment. Maybe it really was just paranoia, just my mind turning every little sound into something worse. And then I saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a shape, a shadow at the bend in the tracks, where the path curved just slightly before disappearing into the trees. A trick of the fading light, maybe, but then it moved. A figure stepped forward from the darkness. Tall, motionless, a hood pulled low over its face, swallowing its features in shadow. I stopped breathing. The figure stood perfectly still, just watching. The blood in my veins felt like ice. My feet refused to move, as if stopping was the worst thing I could do, but so was running. I couldn't tell if it was a man, a teenager, something else. All I knew was that it was there, and it had been following me. I forced my voice out, barely above a whisper. Who's there? No answer. No movement. The wind picked up, sweeping through the trees, making the loose gravel shift beneath my feet. The figure didn't react, didn't acknowledge the sound, didn't flinch. And then, so slowly it made my stomach drop. It tilted its head, like it was studying me, like it was deciding something. I took a slow step back. The figure took a step forward. My stomach twisted, the world narrowing to that single movement. the gravel shifting beneath its feet, the slow, deliberate way it closed the space between us. Then I saw it, a gloved hand, sliding into the pocket of its hoodie. A rush of cold terror surged through me. Was it reaching for something? A knife? A gun? My breath hitched, and before I could think, the words tumbled out of my mouth, sharp and desperate. I have a knife. A lie. A stupid, obvious lie. The figure didn't react, didn't hesitate. Then, in a single, sudden motion, it lunged. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I tore down the tracks, my backpack bouncing wildly against my shoulders. My lungs burned. My breath came in ragged gasps. But I didn't slow down, not even for a second. Behind me, the footsteps followed. Heavy, fast, closing in. I sprinted harder than I ever had in my life, my legs screaming in protest. The gravel slipped beneath my feet, sharp stones biting into my sneakers. The railway stretched on endlessly, an open path with nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape. The trees blurred past in my peripheral vision, dark and tangled. My only chance was the woods. If I could just make it in, maybe I could lose him. I veered off the tracks and lunged toward the tree line. Too late. My foot caught on something, loose dirt, a root, maybe my own panic. I went down hard. The world spun as I crashed into the ditch, the impact rattling my bones. Cold, slimy mud soaked through my jeans, clinging to my hands as I scrambled to push myself up. My vision blurred, my heart hammering. The footsteps were getting closer. 20 feet, maybe less. I twisted my head just enough to look. The figure was there, still hooded, still faceless, but something about the way it stood, stiff, unnatural, predatory, made my insides twist in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. I choked on a sob, panic surging through me like fire. I had to run. I had to run. The pain in my legs didn't matter. The burn in my lungs didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was getting home. The lights of the trailer park flickered in the distance, a beacon through the trees. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the fire in my muscles, the raw scrape of my throat from gasping for air. Just a little farther, just a little more. Behind me, the footsteps thundered against the gravel, steady and relentless. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. If I did, I'd slow down, I'd fall, and I didn't know if I'd get back up this time. Then, just as I reached the entrance to my neighborhood, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I didn't stop running. Not until I was stumbling into my yard, my chest heaving, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly collapsed onto the steps of our trailer. For a moment, I just sat there, gasping, gripping the fabric of my hoodie like it could somehow steady me. What just happened? I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. The footsteps, the hooded figure, the entire chase. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, feeding into my childhood fear of the dark. Maybe it was nothing. But the fear, the sheer, raw terror, that was real. And then, against every ounce of reason, I turned back. I shouldn't have. I should have gone inside, locked the door, buried myself under my blankets. But I didn't. I looked, and the tracks were empty. Just a stretch of gravel disappearing into the dark. No movement, no shadowed figure, nothing at all. I let out a shaky breath. My head felt light, my body still buzzing with adrenaline. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I'd been imagining it after all. Still, I went inside, locked the door, checked it twice. That night, I lay in bed, my heart still refusing to settle. I kept telling myself it was over, that I was safe, that whatever had happened, or hadn't happened, was behind me. But then, just before I turned off my light, something made me look out my window. I didn't know why. Some instinct, some invisible pull. Maybe a final reassurance that I'd been imagining everything. I shifted the curtain aside, and there it was, at the very edge of the tracks. Standing, watching, waiting, the hood still low, the face still hidden, not moving, not leaving, just there. And this time, it wasn't chasing me. It was waiting. I let the curtain drop. I didn't look again, but I knew. It was still there, and it wasn't done with me yet. I used to think I was good at reading people. I'd always been the type to trust my instincts, to pick up on small details that others ignored. But that was before Caleb Morton moved in. Before I learned that some people can slip through the cracks of your judgment. Quiet, unassuming, almost forgettable, until it's too late to do anything about it. It started when we lost our old roommate, Kevin. One day, without warning, he packed up his things and left. No long goodbyes, just a vague excuse about needing to figure some things out. We thought maybe he had family trouble, or maybe he was in some kind of debt he didn't want to talk about. Whatever it was, he left us in a tough spot. There were 4 of us sharing the house. Me, Derek, Matt, and Jess. Rent in this city wasn't cheap, and splitting it 4 ways was already tight. 3 ways was going to be impossible. So we put up an ad, hoping to find someone quickly. Derek was the practical one, always the first to remind us of bills and deadlines. Matt, on the other hand, never took anything seriously. He had this way of brushing off concerns like they were nothing. Conspiracies, paranoia, bad feelings, all of it nonsense to him. Then there was Jess, level-headed, calm, but not one to ignore her gut feelings. She didn't say much, but when she did, we listened. That's why I should have paid attention when she told me she didn't like Caleb. We interviewed a few people before him. A college student who was way too young for our group. A guy who smelled like he'd been living out of his car for a few weeks. A woman who seemed great until she mentioned she had a pet tarantula she refused to part with. Then came Caleb. He was polite, soft-spoken, a little awkward, maybe, but not in a creepy way, just the kind of guy who seemed like he didn't know how to talk to people. He had this strange habit of pausing a little too long before answering questions, like he had to carefully choose every word. I just moved here from up north, he said when I asked where he was from. We're up north. Matt pressed. Oh, kind of all over. That answer didn't sit right with me. Most people would just say a city name, but Caleb spoke like he didn't have a specific place to claim. Jess crossed her arms. I could tell she was watching him closely. What made you move? Just needed a change, he said, offering a small smile. New start and all that. It was vague. Too vague. But the guy had money, and we needed a roommate fast. After he left, Jess was the first to speak. I don't like him. Matt rolled his eyes. You don't even know him. Exactly. Derek sighed. Look, he's not the most talkative guy, but we can't afford to be picky. The guy's got a job, he's quiet, and he's got first and last month's rent. That's good enough for me. I hesitated, but eventually nodded. Jess wasn't happy about it, but in the end, we agreed to let Caleb move in. From the start, something felt off. He kept to himself, which wasn't a bad thing, but it was strange how much he avoided interaction. He'd nod if you greeted him, but never start a conversation. He never invited anyone over. No friends, no family, no phone calls. At night, I'd hear him moving around the house. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing the hallway. Once, I got up to use the bathroom and nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw him standing in the darkened kitchen. Hey man. My voice was still rough from sleep. Everything okay? He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the sink like he was trying to remember why he was there. Then he blinked and turned to me. Yeah, couldn't sleep. I didn't know what else to say, so I just nodded and went back to bed. But after that, I started paying more attention. His room was nearly empty. No posters, no decorations, nothing personal. Just a plain bed, a small desk, and a single old duffel bag that he never unpacked. It was weird. Most people, even if they traveled light, at least had a suitcase, a couple of books, maybe some pictures. But Caleb had nothing. It wasn't until later that I realized. He never unpacked because he was never planning to stay. At first, none of us noticed the inconsistencies in Caleb's stories. He spoke so little that when he did share something personal, we didn't think to question it. But over time, the contradictions started adding up. One evening, we were all sitting in the living room, half watching some dumb reality show while chatting about our pasts. Caleb was sitting on the arm of the couch, staring at the screen but not really watching. I hated the rain growing up, he said suddenly. Matt, surprised that Caleb had actually joined the conversation, smirked. Bad news for you then, dude. This city's got rain for days. Caleb gave a small shrug. Seattle was worse. That caught my attention. I glanced at Derek, who gave me a look like, did he just say Seattle? A few weeks earlier, Caleb had told me he was from the East Coast. I remembered it clearly because I had joked about how he must have struggled adjusting to the slower pace here. But now he was saying Seattle. A couple of days later, when we were cooking dinner, I casually asked him, "Hey, you ever been to New York?" He nodded. "Yeah, grew up near there." My stomach dropped. He wasn't even trying to keep his story straight. That night, I brought it up to Matt and Derek. "Maybe he moved around a lot," Matt said, shrugging it off. "Or maybe he's lying," Jess countered. I decided to ask Caleb directly the next day. "Hey, man, I'm curious. Where exactly are you from?" He smiled, slow and deliberate, like I had just asked a question I shouldn't have. "All over." No explanation, no correction, just that same vague answer he had given before. And the worst part? The way he smiled. It wasn't like he was amused. It was like he was waiting to see if I'd push him further. I didn't. The whispering started about a week later. At first, I thought Caleb was just talking on the phone late at night. I'd wake up to this low, murmuring sound, too muffled to make out any words. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like a mosquito buzzing just outside your ear. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I got out of bed and stepped into the hallway, listening. The sound was coming from Caleb's room. I moved closer. It wasn't a phone call. He was whispering, but not in the way people do when they're trying to keep their voice down. There was a rhythm to it, like a chant, repeating the same sounds over and over. I couldn't understand the words, but they made my skin crawl. I wanted to knock, to ask if he was okay, but something held me back. Instead, I just stood there, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. Then, without warning, the whispering stopped. The silence was worse. I hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. I barely slept that night. The next morning, when we were all in the kitchen, I studied Caleb carefully. He looked the same as always, calm, quiet, distant, like nothing had happened. But I knew what I had heard. The night Jess saw him in the kitchen was when things really took a turn. It was around 3 a.m. when she got up for a glass of water. She didn't think much of it at first, just stumbled out of her room in a half-asleep daze and padded toward the kitchen. That's when she saw him. Caleb was standing in front of the refrigerator, the door slightly open, casting a bluish glow over him. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring inside. Jess assumed he was looking for something to eat. "Hey," she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. No response. She stepped closer. His lips were moving, but the words were too soft to make out. "Caleb." Slowly, he turned to look at her. His eyes were blank, almost like he wasn't really seeing her. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, he said, "You don't belong here." Jess froze. For a long, terrible second, neither of them moved. Then, just as suddenly as he had spoken, he turned back to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked past her like nothing had happened. The next morning, she told us what had happened. "I don't know what to do with that," Matt said, shaking his head. "He could have been sleepwalking." Jess clenched her jaw. He wasn't. I looked over at Caleb, who was sitting at the dining table eating a piece of toast like we weren't discussing him. He didn't even acknowledge what Jess had said, like it never happened. A few days later, I came home early from work. The house was quiet. Matt was still at the office, Jess was out with friends, and Derek was probably at the gym. Caleb was nowhere in sight. As I walked past his room, I noticed something strange. His door was slightly open. Caleb never left his door open. Ever. I hesitated, then glanced around. The house was empty. He wouldn't know. Carefully, I pushed the door open a little more and stepped inside. The room was nearly bare. No clothes in the closet. No books. No decorations. Nothing that made it look like someone actually lived there. Just a neatly made bed, an empty desk, and a small notebook sitting in the middle of the desk. I don't know what possessed me, but I walked over and picked it up. Inside were rows and rows of names and dates. No context, no explanations. Just names, neatly written in block letters, each followed by a date. Some of the dates went back years. Others were recent. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Jess Holloway, March 19th. Derek Yates, March 19th. Matt Connolly, March 19th. Ben Holloway, March 19th. My hands started shaking. That was today's date. A noise behind me made me spin around. Caleb was standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard him come in. Hadn't heard the door open. He didn't look angry. He didn't look surprised. He just smiled. "Find something interesting?" he asked. I couldn't answer. My throat had gone dry. For a long moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Then, slowly, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Jess was never the type to scare easily. She was practical, rational. If she said something was wrong, we all knew to take it seriously. So when she told us what happened that night, none of us doubted her. She woke up to the soft sound of her doorknob turning. Half asleep, she assumed it was one of us, maybe Matt or Derek coming to ask her something. But as she turned onto her side, she noticed the clock on her nightstand. 3:12 a.m. She sat up, heart pounding. The handle turned again, slower this time. Not like someone casually checking if the door was open, but like someone testing it. Then, just beyond the door, she heard whispering. Not loud enough to make out the words at first, just a soft murmur. But as she held her breath and strained to listen, she caught fragments. "The door's open, the walls listen, the time is soon." A chill ran through her body. She reached for her phone, fingers fumbling over the screen. Her hands were shaking too much to type a message. Instead, she focused on the lock. She barely managed to twist it before the handle rattled violently. Not a knock. Not a polite attempt to get in. A sudden, frantic shaking, like someone was trying to force their way inside. Jess held her breath, heart hammering in her chest. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like hours. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. Silence. She didn't sleep after that. She sat up in bed, knees pulled to her chest, waiting for morning. At sunrise, she finally unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. Caleb's door was closed. Later, at breakfast, she stared at him across the table. He ate his toast like nothing had happened. Finally, she broke the silence. "Were you in the hallway last night?" Caleb looked up at her, chewing slowly. Then he frowned, like he was genuinely confused. "No." "What?" Jess didn't say anything. But she knew. And so did I. We couldn't ignore it anymore. That evening, we gathered in the living room. Me, Jess, Derek, and Matt. Caleb sat across from us in the armchair, hands resting on his knees, completely calm. I took a deep breath. "What the hell is going on, Caleb?" His expression didn't change. "What do you mean?" Jess exhaled sharply. "You tried to get into my room last night." "I didn't," he said simply. Matt leaned forward. "You lie about where you're from. You pace the house at night whispering to yourself. You stand in the kitchen at 3 a.m., telling people they don't belong. What the hell is wrong with you?" Caleb didn't flinch. Then he did something that made my stomach twist. He smiled. Not in amusement. Not in surprise. Just a slow, deliberate smile, like he was enjoying this. "You hear them too?" he asked. Silence. I felt something cold creep up my spine. Matt scowled. "What the hell does that mean?" Caleb tilted his head. "The voices. You've been hearing them, haven't you?" I saw Jess's fingers tighten into a fist. She had. So had I. But we hadn't admitted it to each other yet. I swallowed. "Enough. We want you out. Tonight." Caleb didn't argue. He just sat there, still smiling. "You should have let me finish," he murmured. That was it. That was all he said before standing up and walking to his room. None of us followed. By the time morning came, Caleb was gone. His room was empty. Not just empty in the way you'd expect when someone moves out, but completely void of any trace that he had ever been there. No clothes, no trash, no forgotten items. Even the bed was stripped, like he had never existed. We stood in the doorway, staring in disbelief. Matt shook his head. Did he leave in the middle of the night? Derek crossed his arms. Good. Let's just forget about him. But Jess wasn't looking at the empty space. She was looking at the desk. Something was there. A notebook. The same one I had seen before. I hesitated before stepping forward and flipping it open. The list of names was still there, dates neatly written next to them. Some of the names were crossed out. Then I found our names. Ben Holloway, March 19th. Derek Yates, March 19th. Matt Connolly, March 19th. And Jess's name. But hers had a different date. Jess Holloway, March 18th. Last night. She let out a shaky breath. I don't like this. I slammed the notebook shut and grabbed it. Without a word, I walked to the backyard, tossed it into the fire pit, and lit a match. We never spoke about it again. But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up to the sound of whispering. The morning after Caleb left, we felt a collective sense of relief. It was over. He was gone. But something still gnawed at me. The way he had vanished so suddenly. The fact that his room was empty like he had never been there. I decided to check his number. Disconnected. I tried his email. Undeliverable. That didn't make sense. I had seen him use his phone. He had texted us when he moved in. There had to be a record of him somewhere. Derek suggested we call the landlord, just to confirm he was off the lease. But when we did, the landlord hesitated. "There's no Caleb Morton listed as a tenant," he said. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He moved in after Kevin left. He's been paying rent." The landlord sighed. "I don't know what to tell you. The only names on the lease are you, Jess, Matt, and Derek. There's no Caleb. We checked our bank transactions. There were payments that covered his share of rent, but they weren't from a personal account. Just anonymous cash deposits. Then we looked for his rental application, the one he had filled out when he moved in. Gone. Jess and I searched everywhere. Our emails, our paperwork, even the trash. It had vanished. There was no record of Caleb Morton ever living with us. Something inside me refused to let it go. I kept thinking about the notebook, the names, the dates. Something about it felt deliberate, like a pattern I couldn't see yet. So I started looking up the names online. I didn't expect to find anything, but I did. Every name in that notebook belonged to someone who had gone missing. Some had disappeared decades ago, others just a few years ago. Different states, different cities. No apparent connection, except for one thing. Every single one of them had vanished after moving into a shared rental home. Some had been reported missing by roommates, others by landlords who found their rooms abandoned, their belongings untouched. And every case had one eerie detail in common. Just before they disappeared, they had taken in a new roommate. I felt sick. Caleb, if that was even his real name, had done this before, over and over again, and we had let him in. A week passed. We tried to move on. Then, one evening, I stepped outside to take out the trash. There was a package sitting at our front door. No return address. Just a plain manila envelope, sealed tightly. Something inside me screamed not to touch it, but my hands moved anyway. I picked it up, took a breath, and carried it inside. Jess, Matt, and Derek gathered around as I carefully opened it. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. I turned it over, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of us, all four of us, sitting in our living room, laughing. The problem? We had never taken that photo. We stared at it in silence, cold fear washing over us. Then Matt turned it over. Scrawled on the back, in Caleb's familiar handwriting, was a message. There are always more rooms, and always more names. I dropped the photo like it had burned me. We moved out 2 weeks later. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can still hear whispering. I never believed in ghosts, or at least, I told myself I didn't. It was easier that way. Easier to dismiss the stories, the warnings, the strange, creeping sensations that sometimes lingered in old, forgotten places. But some things, no matter how much you try to explain them away, don't leave you. Some things follow. It was the summer after my junior year of college when I came back to my hometown. A small, quiet place in Pennsylvania where nothing much ever happened. I had planned on spending my time at home peacefully, helping my grandmother around the house, and catching up on sleep. But Liam had other ideas. Liam Davis had been my best friend since we were kids. He was the kind of person who sought out the things that made other people uneasy, always chasing after the next thrill. Urban legends, abandoned houses, underground tunnels. He had dragged me into more than a few questionable situations over the years. But this time, I had a bad feeling before we even left my driveway. The old cemetery? I asked, shaking my head. No way, man. My grandma would kill me. She's not even gonna know, Liam said, flashing his usual grin. It's just a quick walk, nothing scary. I sighed. Dude, that place is closed off for a reason. Liam rolled his eyes. Because it's old, not haunted. Come on, Noah. We used to bike past it all the time as kids, and nothing ever happened. What, you scared? That was all it took. Maybe I should have ignored him. Maybe I should have trusted the nagging in my gut. But I didn't. So, against my better judgment, I got into his car, and we drove through the empty roads until we reached the edge of town, where the trees grew taller and the streetlights stopped. The old cemetery had been there for over 200 years. It wasn't in active use anymore, hadn't been for decades. The newer graveyard was a few miles away, cleaner, better maintained. This one was forgotten, overgrown, left to decay with the names of the dead. Every kid in town grew up hearing the stories. People claimed to hear whispers near the tombstones, footsteps that had no source, the feeling of someone right behind you, only to turn and find nothing. A few said they had seen figures standing between the headstones late at night, just watching. Some people went in and never came back. Others came back, different. My grandmother had warned me about the place since I was little. She had grown up here, too, and she never spoke of it lightly. Don't go near there after dark, she had told me countless times, her voice grave. Things walk in that place at night. Things that don't belong in this world. I had always listened. Until now. Liam parked a few blocks away, and we made our way through the trees on foot. The cemetery was surrounded by an old iron fence, its gate rusted and bent inward where other curious visitors had forced their way through. The second I stepped inside, the air felt different. It was summer, humid, thick, but inside those gates, the air was colder, heavy, like the weight of the place itself was pressing down on me. The cicadas had gone silent. Even the wind barely stirred. I hesitated, glancing back at the gate, already thinking of an excuse to leave. But Liam was already ahead, moving confidently through the overgrown grass and broken tombstones. "This place is awesome," he muttered, his flashlight flicking over the cracked stone slabs. Like something out of a horror movie. I swallowed hard and followed. That feeling, like we were being watched, settled deep into my bones. And then, somewhere in the distance, a twig snapped. We walked deeper into the cemetery, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The beams flickered over broken tombstones, some so worn that the names had completely faded away. I kept close to Liam, trying to ignore the gnawing unease in my stomach. Then I noticed something strange. There were no sounds. No crickets, no cicadas, not even the distant hoot of an owl. The summer air, once thick with humidity, now felt eerily still, as if something had stolen all movement from the world. The wind, which had rustled the trees outside the gates, was gone. I slowed my steps. "Liam, you hear that?" He snorted. "Dude, I don't hear anything." "Exactly." He stopped walking then, glancing around, his grin faltering just a little. I could tell he had noticed it, too. The kind of silence that felt wrong, like a held breath. We had just passed a row of crumbling headstones when I heard it. Soft, deliberate, a footstep. I froze. Liam did too. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, another step. Closer. I spun around, my flashlight beams sweeping over the gravestones. Nothing. Liam exhaled sharply. "Jesus, Noah, you're jumpy. You heard that, right?" I whispered. He hesitated. It was probably just us. Echoes or something. I shook my head. No way. The sound hadn't come from us. It had come from behind us. And we weren't walking anymore. The footsteps react to them. A chill crawled up my spine, but I had to be sure. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. My shoe crunched over dead leaves. A second later, another step, but not mine. Liam and I turned at the same time, flashlights darting over the graves, the twisted trees. The path behind us was empty. I stopped moving. The footsteps stopped too. "Liam," I whispered, "tell me you heard that." He didn't answer. I could see it in his face now, the first flicker of doubt. Then, the footsteps started again. Not behind us this time. They moved sideways. Slow, steady, circling us. I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Empty space. The crunch of unseen steps dragged through the brittle grass, moving around us in a slow arc. Something was watching us, moving with us. My breath hitched. "Liam, we need to go." "Wait," he said, but his voice wasn't so steady anymore. It could be an animal. I almost laughed. "That's not a damn animal, Liam." And we both knew it. The air pressed down on me like a weight, thick and suffocating. My skin prickled. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt locked in place. Then, right next to my ear, a whisper. Not words. Not something I could understand. Just the faintest, shivering breath against my skin. I staggered back. Liam, I choked out. His face had gone pale. He was staring past me now, flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. Finally, his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. Let's get out of here. Liam let out a shaky breath, shaking his head as if trying to shake off his unease. This is stupid, he muttered. It's just our minds playing tricks. But I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't as sure as he wanted to be. He bent down, picking up a small rock from the ground. Watch this, he said, forcing a grin. If there was something there, this would. Before I could tell him to stop, he threw it. The rock should have hit the ground, bounced off the dirt, made a sharp clack against the stone path. But it didn't. Instead, a muffled thud, like it had landed on something soft. Something that shouldn't be there. Liam's grin vanished. His hand, still extended from the throw, curled into a fist. The footsteps stopped. The cemetery comes to life. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. A thick, suffocating pause, like the entire cemetery was holding its breath. Then, a crunch of gravel. A step. Another. Faster. Coming toward us. Liam took a step back, nearly tripping over a broken headstone. Noah. The footsteps quickened, the crunching of unseen feet moving in long, purposeful strides. Running. Straight at us. I didn't think. I just ran. Liam was right beside me, our sneakers slamming against the dirt, kicking up dust and dead leaves. But the footsteps behind us, they were faster. And worse. They weren't just behind us anymore. They were everywhere. To our left. To our right. In front of us. Surrounding us. I gasped for breath, my lungs burning. The rusted gate was just ahead, the opening barely visible in the dark. If we could just reach it. Then I felt it. Something grabbed the back of my shirt. An ice-cold grip. Not fingers. Not something human. Just pressure, an invisible force wrapping around the fabric and yanking me backward. I choked out a scream, my feet leaving the ground for half a second. It felt like I was being pulled into the darkness, into whatever was waiting in the cemetery's depths. Liam's hand shot out, grabbing my arm. He yanked me forward with everything he had. The grip on my shirt vanished. I stumbled, nearly crashing into the rusted gate. Liam shoved it open, and we burst out onto the road. The second we crossed the threshold, the footsteps stopped, like they had never been there at all. We kept running. Neither of us looked back. We didn't stop running until we were outside the cemetery gates. The second my feet hit the pavement, the air changed. The heavy weight pressing on my chest lifted. The bone-deep cold that had wrapped around me like unseen fingers faded, replaced by the humid warmth of the summer night. The wind stirred again, rustling the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of crickets, normal sounds. As if the moment we left that place, whatever had been inside stayed behind. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for air. Liam was doubled over too, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Liam let out a nervous laugh, breathless and shaky. He stopped, shaking his head, like he couldn't bring himself to say the words. I didn't answer. I was still trying to convince myself we had really made it out. My heartbeat had barely slowed when I made the mistake of looking back. The cemetery lay in darkness, the tombstones jutting from the ground like broken teeth. At first, it looked empty, just as abandoned as it had when we arrived. Then I saw them. At first, it was just a shift of movement in the shadows, too subtle to be sure. Then, as my eyes adjusted, standing among the graves, not moving, not approaching, just watching. They weren't fully solid, just faint outlines, barely distinguishable from the night. But they were there. I felt my throat close. Liam must have seen them too because he grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "Get in the car," he said under his breath. We didn't need to be told twice. We jumped into Liam's car, slamming the doors shut. He started the engine with shaking hands, his usual cocky grin nowhere in sight. As he pulled onto the road, neither of us spoke. It wasn't until we were miles away, the cemetery far behind us, that Liam finally exhaled. He rubbed his face, his knuckles white. He swallowed hard. Okay, that wasn't normal. I just stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind. The dead don't always rest. But as long as you don't take them with you, they stay where they belong. I clenched my hands into fists, because for the first time, I wasn't sure we had left them behind. I didn't sleep that night. Even after Liam dropped me off, even after I locked every door and window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was still watching. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every sound, every moment in that cemetery. The figures standing in the dark, the unseen grip that had yanked me back, the way the air had shifted the second we crossed the gate, like whatever was inside had let us go. I wanted to believe it had ended there. But then, sometime past 3 a.m., I heard it. A footstep. Inside my room. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers gripped the blanket, my body frozen stiff. Then, another step. Soft. Deliberate. Moving closer. I sat up, my heart hammering. With shaking hands, I fumbled for the lamp on my nightstand and flicked it on. The room flooded with light. It was empty. No one there. Nothing out of place, except my window. It was open. I knew I had locked it. I was sure. And then my eyes dropped to the floor beside my bed. To a small, familiar shape. A rock. My stomach twisted. From somewhere down the hall, just outside my bedroom door, I heard it. Footsteps. Slowly retreating. Moving away. Like something had been here. Standing next to me. Watching. And now, finally, it was leaving. For now. The last thing I saw before we lost cell service was my mother's text. Be careful, Ryan. Don't go too deep into the woods. I didn't think much of it at the time. Parents worry, that's their job. But looking back now, I wish I'd listened. It was early May, just after finals. I was mentally drained, sick of staring at textbooks, and desperate for a break. So when Jake suggested a camping trip, I was all in. A weekend away from everything. No Wi-Fi, no stress, just fresh air and good company. There were 4 of us. Jake, of course, always the leader, always fearless. He was the kind of guy who'd charge headfirst into anything, whether it was a midnight swim in freezing water or a bar fight with a guy twice his size. Then there was Alex, the skeptic. He never believed in ghosts, urban legends, or anything remotely supernatural. To him, the world was simple. What you see is what you get. And finally, there was Lena. Quiet, thoughtful, always watching. She was the kind of person who noticed things before anyone else did. We hiked deep into the forest, past the usual camping spots, looking for something more secluded. Jake wanted adventure. No point in camping if we're just going to be surrounded by people, he said. We followed a narrow, barely used trail until we found the perfect place, a clearing near a lake, with no other campers in sight. That's when I first noticed the silence. At first, I didn't think much of it. But as the sun started to set, it became impossible to ignore. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just stillness. Even the wind seemed to have disappeared. This place feels weird, Lena muttered, mostly to herself. Alex rolled his eyes. Oh no, don't start with that bad-feeling stuff. Jake laughed. It's called peace and quiet. That's what we came here for, right? But Lena wasn't convinced. I could see it in her face. And to be honest, I felt it too. As we set up camp, I noticed something on the trail behind us, a footprint. It was faint but fresh, pressed into the soft dirt. I froze for a second, looking back the way we'd come. We hadn't passed anyone on the way in, and the only footprints on the trail should have been ours. Guys, I said, pointing at the print. Did any of you come back this way? Jake squinted at it, then grinned. Oh, spooky. Maybe it's a ghost. Alex snorted. Or maybe a ranger or a hunter. People do exist, you know. I nodded, but the uneasiness didn't leave me. Because something about that footprint felt wrong. And we weren't alone. The fire crackled, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. The 4 of us sat in a loose circle, eating instant noodles out of tin camping cups and trading stories. Jake was in the middle of telling one of his usual exaggerated tales. Something about a bear he supposedly fought off with nothing but a flashlight, when we heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, approaching from the darkness beyond the firelight. I froze, my spoon hovering midair. We all turned toward the sound, straining to see past the trees. A moment later, a man stepped out from the shadows. His clothes were dirty, tattered at the edges, and he moved with an unsettling stillness. The firelight cast strange, flickering patterns on his face, making it hard to read his expression. His eyes, dark and sunken, never left us. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice low and emotionless, the man muttered, "You shouldn't be here." The words hung in the air, heavy and wrong. We exchanged nervous glances. Jake, ever the fearless one, forced a laugh. "Why not?" he asked, flashing that cocky grin of his. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, staring. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the darkness of the trees. None of us moved. The only sound was the distant lapping of the lake against the shore. The hell was that? I finally muttered. "Some weirdo," Alex said, shaking his head. "Probably some drifter living out here." "Maybe," I said, but my voice didn't sound convincing. Lena was still watching the trees where the man had vanished. Her fingers gripped the edge of her camping cup so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "What?" I asked. She swallowed. There weren't any other cars at the trailhead. I frowned, my stomach twisting. She turned to look at us, her voice quiet but steady. "If he's a hiker, where did he come from?" No one had an answer, and suddenly, the silence of the forest felt suffocating. We tried to move on, to laugh it off, but something about that man lingered in the air like a bad taste. Even Jake, who usually brushed off anything remotely unsettling, seemed quieter than usual. As the fire burned lower, I kept catching myself glancing at the trees, expecting to see him again. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then a sound, a soft snap, a twig breaking somewhere just beyond the fire's glow. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Jake stiffened. Lena's eyes darted toward the trees. Alex sighed, shaking his head, but even he reached for his flashlight. I clicked mine on and swept the beam across the darkness. Trees, bushes, nothing else. No movement. Still, the feeling remained. Something was out there, watching. Hours passed, and we eventually crawled into our tents, though sleep didn't come easy. The night felt heavier than usual, like the air itself was pressing down on us. I lay on my back, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, listening to the occasional pop of the dying fire. At some point, I must have dozed off. Then, a hand on my arm. I jolted awake, heart hammering. It was Lena. She was crouched beside me, her face barely visible in the dim glow of my watch. "Ryan." Her whisper was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Someone's out there." Instantly, I was alert. I strained my ears. At first, nothing. But then, a faint rustling. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving just beyond the campsite. I held my breath, listening. The sound wasn't constant. Whoever, or whatever, was out there would move, then stop. Move, then stop. Almost like they knew we were listening. Lena's grip on my arm tightened. I carefully unzipped the tent, just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to glowing embers, barely illuminating the clearing. The trees beyond were nothing but darkness. Then, Alex gasped, a sharp intake of breath. I turned my head fast. His tent was already unzipped, and he was half out of it, his flashlight shaking in his hand. His voice came out in a whisper, a single word. "Look." I followed his gaze to the edge of the trees, and there he was, the man, standing perfectly still, watching us. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, barely visible in the darkness, staring. My blood turned to ice, because now there was no doubt. He never left. He'd been out there, waiting. Jake reacted first. He shot up from his tent, grabbed his flashlight, and stormed toward the fire pit. "What the hell do you want?" he shouted, his voice breaking the eerie stillness. He flicked the flashlight toward the trees, and the man was gone, just vanished. No sound of retreating footsteps, no movement, nothing. 1 second he was there, and the next, the trees stood empty, as if he had never been there at all. I felt my stomach twist. The hair on my arm stood on end. Where, Alex swallowed hard. Where did he go? Lena's voice was barely above a whisper. We need to leave. Now. For once, no one argued. We scrambled into action, throwing our gear into backpacks with shaking hands. None of us cared about packing properly, just shoving everything in, desperate to be gone. That's when we heard it. Footsteps. Not distant, not fading, but close. Moving fast. And not just one set. Multiple. All around us. Lena gasped, spinning toward the darkness. I snatched my flashlight and flicked it in the direction of the sound, but the trees swallowed the light, revealing nothing. Oh my God, Alex whispered. There's more than one. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just some drifter. We weren't alone. Move, Jake barked. We didn't hesitate. With our half-pack gear, we bolted for the trail, flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran. The night swallowed us, branches whipping against our arms and faces. Behind us, the footsteps followed. Fast. Unnatural. I dared one glance back, and my stomach dropped. Dark figures moved between the trees, just beyond the reach of our lights. Too many. Too close. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. They had been waiting, and they were hunting us. We tore through the forest, lungs burning, feet slamming against the dirt trail. The figures moved between the trees, always just out of reach, never revealing themselves fully. But they were there, and they were close. Branches snapped behind us. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, never stopping. Then, like a miracle, the trees thinned. Gravel crunched under our feet as we stumbled onto the clearing where our car was parked. Jake was already yanking open the driver's side door. Alex fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly he could barely fit them into the lock. Then, silence. Complete, suffocating silence. The footsteps stopped. The rustling stopped. The night was still again, just like before. I turned back toward the trees, breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures were gone. No movement. No eyes watching from the darkness. Nothing. Like they had never been there at all. Alex finally managed to unlock the car, and we piled in, slamming the doors shut. The engine roared to life, and Jake floored the gas pedal. None of us spoke. We just drove. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest ranger station, miles away from the trail. It was nearly 3 a.m. when we burst through the doors, looking like hell, dirty, scraped up, and wide-eyed with panic. A tired-looking ranger behind the desk raised an eyebrow. I swallowed, still out of breath. There was someone in the woods. People. Chasing us. The ranger's face darkened. He leaned forward. Where? We told him everything. About the man at our campsite. About the figures in the trees. About the footsteps that had followed us. The feeling of being hunted. The ranger listened carefully, his frown deepening. When we finished, he sat back and exhaled slowly. That's not possible. The words sent a chill down my spine. What? Lena's voice was hoarse. What do you mean? The ranger shook his head. There weren't supposed to be any other campers in that area tonight. No permits were issued for the backwoods site you were at. Stunned silence. You were supposed to be the only ones there. The room suddenly felt too small. Too cold. Alex opened his mouth, then shut it again. His hands were still shaking. But I forced the word out, my mind racing. We saw him. The man. The others. They were real. The ranger hesitated. Then, lowering his voice, he said, There used to be an old hermit living deep in those woods, years ago. People said he would warn hikers before they disappeared. The blood drained from my face. Lena whispered, What happened to him? The ranger shook his head. No one knows. He vanished a long time ago. But, he paused, eyes flicking toward the window, toward the black expanse of the forest beyond. No one's seen him in decades. None of us spoke on the drive home. None of us ever camped in those woods again. And to this day, I still dream about those figures, standing at the edge of the trees, waiting, because I know, deep down, we were never supposed to leave that forest alive. And somehow, I think they'll be waiting for the next ones who wander too far. A week passed. None of us spoke much after that night. We went back to our lives, back to school, back to pretending that what happened was just some strange, twisted misunderstanding. But deep down, none of us truly believed that. And then, The package arrived. There was no return address, no markings, just a plain, unassuming envelope sitting in my mailbox. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. My breath caught in my throat as I pulled it out. My hands trembled. It was a picture of our campsite, taken at night. The fire was glowing, our tents in the background. And there we were, me, Jake, Alex, Lena, all sitting around the flames. But my eyes weren't drawn to us. They were drawn to the trees behind us. Because there, just at the edge of the firelight, was a shadowy figure. Standing, watching. I dropped the photo like it burned me, my pulse thundering in my ears. My stomach twisted, my vision blurred. I didn't remember anyone taking this picture. I didn't remember him standing there. The room felt smaller, colder. The same suffocating stillness from the forest crept in around me. And then, a sound, faint, from outside my window. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the glow of my porch light. I didn't check. I didn't look. I just locked the door and sat there, gripping the Polaroid with white-knuckled hands, listening. The footsteps stopped, and I knew, without a doubt, I was never supposed to leave those woods. And maybe, just maybe, I never really did. I didn't plan on stopping. The night was thick with the weight of exhaustion, and my mind felt like it had been wrung dry. I had spent the last 4 nights driving aimlessly, circling the city like a stray dog that had nowhere to be. Insomnia had a way of making the world feel unreal, and I had long since stopped expecting sleep to come. Instead, I kept moving. Tonight, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a rundown diner on the outskirts of town. The neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly, the red glow distorting the letters, Eddie's Diner. The place looked like it had been standing there forever, forgotten by time, but still open for those who wandered in late at night. People like me. I stepped inside, the little bell above the door letting out a hollow chime. The air smelled of burnt coffee and stale grease. A few tables lined the walls, their vinyl seats cracked and patched with duct tape. A long counter stretched across the room, lined with faded bar stools. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, wiping it down with slow, deliberate strokes. She looked up briefly, offering a tired nod before returning to her task. Behind the kitchen window, a cook moved sluggishly, his face half hidden in the dim light. I spotted a booth in the far corner, away from the windows, and slid into it. The clock on the wall let out a soft tick, 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 the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I rubbed my temples. My head was pounding, the result of too many nights without rest. When the waitress came over, I ordered coffee. Black. I tried to lose myself in the rhythmic hum of the place, but there was something unsettling about it. The neon sign outside cast strange shadows through the blinds, shapes that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The place felt almost too quiet, the kind of silence that made your own thoughts louder. Then, the bell above the door rang again. I looked up. A man had entered. He was tall, unnaturally so, his shoulders narrow beneath the sharp cut of an old-fashioned black suit. His skin was pale, stretched tight over high cheekbones. He walked with a deliberate, measured pace, his footsteps almost soundless on the worn tile floor. And then, despite the empty diner, despite the rows of vacant seats, he sat down directly across from me. I felt a strange weight settle in my chest. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't acknowledge the waitress. He simply folded his hands on the table and stared at me. And I stared back. I waited for him to say something. Anything. But he just sat there. His hands were folded neatly on the table, fingers long and unnaturally still. His suit was pristine, the fabric smooth and dark, as if he had stepped out of another era. His eyes, sharp, cold, never left mine. They weren't just looking at me. They were examining me. The silence stretched too long. The diner's clock ticked behind him. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly. Then, at last, he spoke. "You look tired." His voice was smooth, deliberate. There was something rehearsed about it, like he had practiced those words before saying them. "You've been looking for answers, haven't you?" A cold prickle ran down my spine. I forced out a dry laugh. "What?" He tilted his head slightly, as if he was amused by my reaction. The faintest trace of a smile curled at the edges of his lips, but it wasn't reassuring. It was calculated. I shifted in my seat. "Do I know you?" He ignored my question. "People like you," he continued, "have trouble sleeping. The mind becomes restless. It searches when it should be at rest. You think driving will help. You think movement will quiet it." His fingers tapped once against the table. "But it doesn't, does it?" I swallowed. My mouth was dry. He shouldn't know that. I glanced at the waitress, but she wasn't paying attention. She was pouring coffee behind the counter, staring blankly at the black liquid filling the pot. The cook was gone. I hadn't even noticed him leave. The man in front of me leaned slightly forward. "I can help." The words were spoken with absolute certainty, like a fact, like something undeniable. I forced myself to hold his gaze. "Who are you?" His smile widened, just a fraction. "The doctor." It wasn't an answer. Not really. But it was all he gave. The way he said it, like a title rather than a name, made my stomach tighten. "Doctor of what?" I asked, my voice lower now. No response. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out. A small glass vial. He placed it on the table between us and slid it toward me. The liquid inside was clear, colorless, almost like water. "Drink this," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "and you'll finally see things the way they truly are." A strange pressure settled in my mind, like a hand pressing gently against my skull. I stared at the vial. I should have laughed. I should have pushed it back, gotten up, left. But I didn't. Because, somehow, deep down, I knew that if I walked away, I would never know what he meant. And that terrified me more than anything. I exhaled slowly and pushed the vial back toward him. "No thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I don't take drinks from strangers." The doctor didn't move. His expression didn't change, but the air around him felt heavier. Like the space between us was thickening, pressing inward. I picked up my coffee, forcing my hand to stay steady as I took a sip. Bitter, lukewarm. The taste grounded me, if only slightly. "You expect me to just drink something a random guy slides across the table?" I scoffed, setting the mug down. "Come on. What is this, some kind of prank?" The doctor blinked, slow, deliberate. "A prank," he repeated, as if tasting the word. Then, he gave the smallest shake of his head. "No, Daniel. This is far from a joke." Something about the way he said my name made my stomach twist. I hadn't told him my name. Before I could react, the waitress appeared beside me, coffee pot in hand. "Refill." I looked up at her, half relieved for the interruption. "Yeah, sure." She poured the coffee, the dark liquid swirling into my cup. I turned slightly, expecting her to at least glance at the man sitting across from me. Maybe ask him if he wanted anything. She didn't. She didn't even look at him. She capped the pot, gave me a polite nod, and walked back behind the counter. I stared at her retreating form. The doctor let out a soft chuckle. "They never see what they're not meant to," he said, almost amused. A cold sensation trickled down my spine. I turned back to him, my throat suddenly dry. "What do you mean by that?" He didn't answer. He just sat there, watching. Outside, the neon sign flickered wildly, the buzzing sound sharp and erratic. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the diner floor, warping with each flash of red light. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls of the diner were pressing inward. I placed my hands on the table, palms down, trying to steady myself. My fingers trembled. I hadn't drunk anything from the vial. So why did I feel different? The doctor stood. The movement was smooth, controlled, almost too fluid. He adjusted his cuffs, smoothing out his suit. "Whether you drink or not," he said, his voice quieter now, "it doesn't matter." He reached down and tapped the vial lightly with one finger. "Tap. You're already beginning to see." Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. I wanted to call after him, to demand an explanation, but my voice wouldn't come. The bell above the door let out a soft chime as he stepped outside. And then he was gone. But the vial. The vial was still sitting on the table. Something was wrong. The second the doctor left, the diner felt different. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, their glow suddenly too harsh, casting strange, jagged shadows across the floor. The air had changed too. Thicker, heavier, pressing against my skin like an unseen force. I glanced at the waitress behind the counter. She was standing completely still, her back turned to me. Not pouring coffee, not moving at all. The cook, who I hadn't heard return, stood in the kitchen window, staring blankly at the grill. His hands were still, his face frozen in some unreadable expression. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. A deep, crawling unease gripped my chest. I looked down at my coffee. The surface of the liquid was rippling. Tiny, unnatural waves disturbed the dark surface, like something underneath was shifting. But there was no movement, no vibration. The cup wasn't even touched. I turned my head toward the diner's clock. Tick. The second hand moved, but too slowly, as if it were dragging itself forward through something thick and unseen. Tick. It wasn't right. None of this was right. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. The sound was wrong, too loud, distorted, like it echoed in a space much larger than the diner itself. I needed air. I stumbled toward the door, shoving it open, stepping out into the cool night. Silence. The street was empty. Not just quiet, completely, utterly vacant. No cars, no distant headlights, no pedestrians, no wind. Just an unnatural, suffocating stillness. I turned back toward the diner, trying to ground myself. But as I did, my breath caught in my throat. My reflection was staring back at me through the glass window. But it wasn't right. I lifted my hand. My reflection did the same, just a second too late. My chest rose and fell, but the version of me in the window breathed slower, more controlled, as if it wasn't copying me, but deciding how to move. Then it blinked, too slow, and then it smiled. Not a normal smile, a wrong smile. Something deep in my gut twisted violently. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. My foot caught the edge of the curb, and I nearly fell. The streetlights above began to hum, a deep, vibrating sound that rattled through my skull. It wasn't static. It wasn't just noise. It was whispering. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping my temples. And then, clear as day, I heard his voice. It's already begun. The doctor's voice. Inside my head. Now you'll know what they don't. The world tilted. My stomach lurched. And in the glass window of the diner, my reflection kept watching. And it didn't look away. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. The pavement beneath me felt unsteady, as if the street itself was stretching, warping beneath my feet. The buildings around me seemed taller than before, their darkened windows like empty eyes staring down at me. Something was wrong with the streetlights. They flickered, but not in the way lights normally did. Their glow pulsed, stretching in unnatural directions, as if the light itself was being pulled and twisted. And then, I saw them. Figures. Tall, skeletal figures lurking in the shadows between the buildings. Their limbs were too long, their faces obscured by the darkness. But they were watching. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing them to be gone. When I opened them, they were closer. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned and ran for my car, parked just beyond the diner. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys in my pocket. They were ice cold, far too cold, as if I had pulled them from a block of ice. I yanked the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat, slamming the lock down. My fingers trembled as I shoved the key into the ignition. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the steering wheel, trying to ground myself. Then, in the rearview mirror, my reflection was there, but it wasn't right. The angle was wrong. The eyes weren't mine. They were watching me, calculating, patient. And then, just behind me, a whisper brushed against my ear, though no one was there. They've always been here. A sharp, crawling sensation spread through my spine. My throat went dry. You just never saw them. I couldn't breathe. I twisted the key. The engine roared to life. I slammed the car into gear and sped forward, tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. The shadows twisted around me as I drove. The buildings loomed unnaturally high. The streetlights flickered violently, stretching my own shadow in impossible directions. And then, as I passed beneath one of the streetlights, I saw him, the doctor, standing on the sidewalk, perfectly still. But something was wrong. The streetlight above cast light in every direction. And yet, he cast no shadow. The realization sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Slowly, he tilted his head and smiled, like he had expected this, like he had always known, like this was exactly how it was supposed to happen. I pressed my foot down on the gas, speeding past him, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. But in the mirror, I swore I saw him watching me. And this time, he waved. I never went back to the diner. In fact, I stopped going anywhere after dark. It didn't help. The first few nights after that night, I tried to tell myself it had all been exhaustion, a stress-induced hallucination. My brain had finally cracked under the weight of too many sleepless nights. But then, the world started changing. The shadows were the first thing I noticed. They moved when they shouldn't. I would be sitting in my apartment, alone, the only light coming from the dim glow of my desk lamp. And yet, from the corner of my eye, I would see a shadow slide across the wall, slow, deliberate, as if something just beyond my sight was shifting. The mirrors were worse. Every time I caught my own reflection, it seemed off. At first, it was little things, a delay when I moved, a flicker in my expression. Then, one night, I leaned in close to the bathroom mirror and whispered under my breath, "What are you?" And I swear I saw my reflection smile, even though I didn't move. By the third night, I knew there was no going back. I had seen something I wasn't meant to, and it had seen me. The package arrived on the fifth night. I found it sitting on my doorstep, no postage, no return address. Just a plain, unmarked envelope. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Inside was a single Polaroid. I stared at it for a long time, my breath caught in my throat. It was a photo of the diner. I was sitting in the booth, exactly as I had been that night, my tired face, my hands curled around a cup of coffee. But the booth across from me was empty. No doctor, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Just me, alone. A small, yellowed note was tucked behind the photo. I unfolded it with numb fingers, reading the words scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. "You didn't need the drink, Daniel. You were always meant to see." The room felt colder. I swallowed hard, looking around my apartment, suddenly unsure if I was really alone. I burned the note. I burned the photo. It didn't matter, because I still saw them. In the reflections, in the shadows, in the spaces that shouldn't hold anything at all. And every night, just before sleep finally tries to take me, I hear the whisper. Soft, patient. You'll understand soon. I don't know if I'm going insane. I don't know if reality itself is unraveling. But I do know one thing. The doctor will return. And next time, I don't think I'll have a choice.
And so, dear listeners, we reach the end, or perhaps just another beginning. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the shadows, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which story haunted you the most. But before you go, remember, the dark is never truly empty.